If you look at this build manual, it says to cover and mount the dash before messing with anything on the body. Here it's showing you where to mount it and how far down. Wants you to do that before you're messing with the body. But I've been told that you really don't want to mount the dash until you get the body on the car, because there's a gap here between the body and the dash, and you want to be able to take that dash and push it up flush against the body so there's no gap or minimal gap. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover and mount the dash, but I'm going to mount it low, and we're going to consider this a trial run because I want to see how it looks covered with the hardware that I chose. This is the hardware that I chose for fashioning the dashboard onto the frame. We've got a finish, I think they call that a finish washer. You know, it's got a bevel to it. And then I like these Phillips that have this angle on it right here. And those fit in there pretty nice, and I think that looks pretty good and decorative. They're probably a little big. I don't know. Go big or go home, right? And then that will fasten into a Rivnut from a kit here. Well, I think this is a really good example of how not to do these Rivnuts or threaded inserts. This first one I measured wrong. It's too close to the rail here, so I had to move it down and over. On this second one that I tried, I measured correctly, but the hole was too big, so the Rivnut wouldn't go in there, so I had to drill it again in the upper right. This one, I drilled it to the right a little bit, and just in case I screwed it up, I could try again over here. So definitely we learn as we go, but I did get them in there okay. Well, I'm pretty happy with that. Those are 3 pretty hefty fasteners, and I think they look pretty good. Of course, this center one looks the best there. But once I get the dash cover on there, I think it's gonna look really good. And I'll cover up those extra holes, my mistake holes. But I'm pretty happy with that, I guess. If you saw the first driving video, you saw that the car died on the second time I took it down the street. So I'm learning that's because of the VSS signal was not hooked up. Basically, if there's a load on the engine and the engine doesn't know, the engine computer doesn't know that the car is moving, it's going to try and correct for that and lower the idle, which eventually kills the engine, I guess. So I've been trying to figure out how to integrate this VSS into this Ron Francis wiring that came with the kit here. And I figured out a few things, and I'll show you a few things that have been tripping me up on how to get this thing integrated. If we look down here at the transmission, we can see the output from the transmission. So these are the VSS wires, the vehicle speed sensor that originally came with my engine. In the donor truck, the 2006 GMC Sierra, these ran from the transmission all the way up to the computer and sent a signal to the engine computer, the speed of the vehicle. I think I figured out how to wire these into this Ron Francis wiring harness, and I'll show you what I came up with. One problem I'm having is these 2 wires that come out of the transmission, they're both black. So there's not one labeled high or low signal. The Ron Francis wiring harness that came with this kit does have a speedo input, and that is located right here. And here it is in the wiring diagram in the build manual. Looking at these loose wires that came with my engine wiring harness, which came adapted to be a standalone harness, one of these wires, this green and white, is labeled Speedo to ECU. If we look at the directions that came with my engine wiring harness here, and we find that dark green and white wire, it reads, connect this wire to your speedometer input. This is the signal from the ECM to operate your electronic speedometer. But for the ECU to have a speed signal output, it would already need a speed signal input. This would come from the VSS wires that are not hooked up. This is the Automotive speedometer here. And if we look at the back, this is the input, and then this right there is an output. So if we look at the Automotive electric speedometer instructions, you can see this output here, VSS to ECM, and C note. The note says the speedometer signal output terminal VSS produces a +5 volt DC square wave signal. This signal may be able to be used as a VSS signal with some OEM and aftermarket ECMs and cruise control units. So it seems to me that this output from the Autometer speedometer gauge is also maybe just a repeater of the speedo input signal. Back to the chassis wiring harness installation instructions, we can see from the rear harness the speedo signal wires. Then if we look at the dash harness connections, we find that the speedo signal goes from the transmission to the gauge is split right here. One reads dark green speedo signal and the other reads dark green EFI speedo signal. In addition, you can see this gray EFI speedo signal return wire. So to review, we know that this transmission has a signal output. The ECU needs a signal input. The Ron Francis wiring harness needs a signal input. This ECU right here has a signal output. This speedometer gauge takes an input and also has an output right here. The original problem was, how am I going to integrate this VSS into this Ron Francis wiring harness? So I figured out that this speedo signal already goes through these wiring harnesses and into the dash harness as a signal into the speedo gauge. It's also split, and I think that's it right there. See how there's two green wires? They already split this high signal for me, and that's gonna be the speed sensor. This should read EFI speed sensor. Therefore, I can take this VSS, I can run this back to this side of the firewall. So it's gonna go directly from this ECU, and instead of running back through the tunnel, I'm gonna pull it back, feed it through my new grommet that I made. And then I'm gonna hook that up to the existing wires here, Ron Francis wires. EFI speedo signal return is the gray, and then this one is mismarked speed sensor. This should be EFI speed sensor. That's what's been throwing me for a loop on how to get this thing wired up. So one thing that's been throwing me for a loop on this wiring diagram is this wire is labeled dark green EFI speedo signal, and the one next to it is labeled dark green speedo signal. But if you follow this dark green speedo signal down and to the right and up, now it's labeled dark green EFI speedo signal. So I think there's a bit of a mistake there in this wiring diagram. In addition, this gray EFI speedo signal return is split here and runs up into the dash. And as my understanding, the Autometer speedometer gauge does not use that. Maybe there's a gauge out there that does use that. I have no idea. But now that I think I got it figured out, I'm gonna take these VSS wires that originally came with the engine, and I'm gonna run those through my new grommet, coil them up, and then hook them up into the wiring harness.